template.
Yes, this is a never been used before template. So, so greeting the second space race. Boy, oh boy, has it been a dazzling year. 2018, filled with cars in space, China landing on the far side of the moon, plenty of other things going on. The reason I call it second space race or space race 2.0, this is a pretty good track of the Cold War. U.S. started back in 1957, U.S. and Soviet Union going at it hard. Soviet Union really fell off hard, and now China's coming up big. This was 2018 right here, biggest year. So we're sending a lot of rockets into space. That's a big deal. They pollute too. So here's some numbers. 5,038 number of rockets the world has sent into space since 1957. 1979 is a problematic number. That's the last international space agreement we had. That's the Moon Agreement. 72, the number of countries with space agencies. That doesn't mean they've sent stuff into space. They have an agency. 330 billion is what people are saying the global space industry is worth. So it's a big thing, big problem. And that zero is supposed to be up there. 114 was the number of rockets that the world sent into space in 2018. 80 is what we've been averaging annually. And as you remember from that graph, we're spiking up. So anyway, just to get a better sense of the global footprint of the space industry. So again, the issue here is that rockets aren't fueled by water. They shoot the emissions of rocket propellant 1 into the atmosphere. That includes soot and alumina, which are geoengineering agents. They can change and mitigate the climate in ways that we don't understand or want. And also they have a negative effect on our precious ozone. We're going to talk a lot more about Montreal Protocol. So, what's difficult about this issue? Why don't we just stop sending rockets up in space? Well, first of all, we're trying to govern an area that's 10 to 30 miles up, stratosphere. That's the area where the ozone is. It's difficult enough to manage a city, so try governing that. The immediacy of the problem, this I found in an EPA report. So we've got plenty of sectors that pollute. The space industry would just be a small sliver of, I don't even know, transportation? Anyways, other energy. So they're nothing right now. And again, we're trying to govern this space, which is very difficult to manage if you're trying to gather information on risk assessment and risk management. You can't just send weather balloons up there infinitely. So, seems like we've got a pretty difficult problem if we're going to try to manage rocket emissions in the stratospheres, but don't be disheartened. I think the solution is going to be pretty awesome. It's going to be a tipping point. Like Malcolm Gladwell said, it's going to be contagious. There's going to be a little cause with a big effect, and it's not going to be a gradual, linear change. It's going to be a systemic switch. But how could that possibly happen? Well, first of all, the little cause, big effect. Back in the Montreal Protocol, it was this image. I'm pretty certain I wasn't there. But this image was a hole in our roof, and that really affected people. They said, oh my God, now we're susceptible to the sun's rays, solar storms. This is terrible. We can't do this to our planet. So this was way back in the day, and that very much catalyzed the Montreal Protocol. By the way, we just celebrated its 30th anniversary. It was a huge success, as you may remember, 197 signatories. So that's what we'd sort of like on the space race. But how's that all going to start out? America. And the reason why, it's not going to be private industry. They hate self-regulating. It's not going to be the international community, because again, the last big international agreement for space was the 1979 Moon Agreement. The United Nations doesn't really have any teeth. So it's going to be us. It's going to come out of universities, not necessarily these ones, but maybe some of them. The reason I say that is because all the Montreal Protocol emanated from research done by chemists at UC Irvine. Thanks, America. Also, we've led the race when it comes to other big research endeavors, such as mitigating orbital debris, and also managing risks like explosions, stuff like that. The Challenger disaster commission was, I mean, that's like the gold standard. So anyways, our interagency framework is pretty awesome. But it can't just be the US, it has to include China. And the reason why is because this last year we had our 34 launches, they had 39. They're stepping up to the plate. It's a tense time, and especially with these trade talks, especially with certain politicians, we might think that we're totally at odds with China, but I view it as an opportunity for negotiation. I looked at a few treaties of the past in incredibly tense times between the United States and Soviet Union. Back in the 70s, we got together and agreed to ban nuclear testing. And we also reduced arms back in the 1990s. So it can be done with the right research, the right attitude, the right approach. So once the US and China get on board with this, then we can expect to see a little bit more wider adoption by other space agencies and nations, similar to the Montreal Protocol signatories signing on. And of course, private enterprise, government agencies, laws, that all comes from there. So some of the mechanisms that would then stem from all this cool momentum from American leadership and compelling images and US-China collaboration and stuff is going to include people building on existing hard laws, like these ones, utilizing soft laws, which include agreements, declarations, and principles for when you can't enact your hard laws. It's too difficult. Capacity building workshops and working groups, those actually already exist within the United Nations. Again, it's just going to have to be a more precise and specific problem that we're looking at. We have to choose our enemy. That's our enemy. So anyways, this all seems easy. I'm not Nostradamus though. So it's not necessarily going to happen like this. It's a very complicated problem. Lots of different moving parts and things to regulate. And we have to figure this out. The Aerospace Corporation Center for Space Policy puts it verbosely. If we regulate correctly, this could forestall unwarranted regulation, ensure regulatory impartiality across the global launch fleet, where regulation is unavoidable, and facilitate launch industry freedom of action in crafting responses to environmental concerns. Basically, do it now because it's easier. So, anyways, that's that. We're going to figure out rocket emissions, people.
Yeah.
Questions? No?
Okay. I wonder if you could talk more about the soft laws that you started to address. I think you went over that kind of quickly.
Oh, yes.
Hear more about what you need there.
I didn't look into those too much. I just sort of have hope that people are pretty cool about non-binding agreements, stuff like that, where it's just like, hey, we endeavor to reduce our emissions. And again, a lot of times it sounds really weak, but that's a start.
Yeah.
And it's something that you can build off of and then incorporate that language into hard laws once people get acclimatized to, yes, endeavor to do this. So, great. Anyways. Yes, Beatrice.
Okay, more of a statement.
Yes.
I think flying into space is stupid. And we should
It's incredibly
focus
dangerous.
on-
Yeah.
I don't know, I mean, did you run into anything that was like, should we be even focusing on flying into space, and should we be focusing more on this planet that like can actually sustain us?
That was not my focus, but that is an incredibly valid point that I think many people on the internet are probably talking about. And especially, well, I guess the biggest one, I might have mentioned this in one of our classes. I wasn't quite sure which direction I was going to go. I was thinking maybe I would talk about orbital debris. That's a huge issue. We've got this huge cloud of pollution over our planet, and especially that first image of the Tesla Roadster or whatever hurtling towards Mars. It's like, why, well, that's not going to land safely.
That was just a point for me where I went from like,
He tried
maybe one is okay.
Yeah.
This guy is
So yeah,
not me, okay.
you're right. Plenty of negative impacts there. I don't think we're going to stop it though. So, yeah.
Any guess at, I mean, it sounds like this huge problem and like, oh gosh, we're putting all this pollution and debris up in the atmosphere, but considering like how much pollution and debris there is on Earth, any guess at like what percentage or like the scale compared to earthbound emissions or?
No, in terms of numbers, I don't have it. Come on, where are we guys? But
There.
yeah, so there is a huge difference between these levels of our atmosphere, of which there were 5 levels, and a lot of the pollution that takes place down here tends to stay down here. Once you start piercing through the stratosphere and polluting up there, that's a whole separate thing. So, I mean, us polluting down here is obviously terrible, and we should mitigate that, but it is very different than us passing through this threshold.
Mm-hmm.
They do some instances.
And then do pollutants in the stratosphere stay in the stratosphere, or do they kind of get diluted and fritter off into space?
The studies that I was looking at, it seems, by the way, that there was a very long delay between when we started enacting the Montreal Protocol back in like 1987, the early 90s, and when the acceleration of the whole slowed and then stopped. I mean, that wasn't until very recently, like maybe even a decade ago. So the way that this works is much slower. Of course, there's some like osmosis between the different spheres, but yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question. Percentage is tough to. Again, it's incredibly difficult to risk assess up here. To send balloons or whatever you're sending up 6 miles up, and there's just not a lot of research. Everyone in these papers was saying we need to fund research more, but it's not a problem yet, so we can't find the funding. Big catch-22. Yes.
Are there any NGOs that have picked up this issue and are trying to stir up the pot? Or?
There are a lot of, I mean, I just know the American groups best. There are plenty of foundations and centers for study, government groups, NGOs, not off the top of my head, but there are industry organizations.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And like little PR wings of private sector groups. So there are do-gooders. Yeah. Yes.
But you said the UN had some stuff going on, but you said they started with teeth. What do they have going on?
So they have a few different working groups. Some of these have been going on for about a decade or so. And they have incredibly long and annoying to read names. But these are working groups on the sustainability of space and the peaceful use of space. So, and they try to bring the different country players to the table. And again, they have some history there, about a decade at least. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Next up is Beatrice.
We started putting our garbage in this.
Yeah.
What do we send our waste up?
Or
I should have said people.
How much experience?
How many screens should we have?
Oh, right. Yeah. 7. Nice. Funny.